I thought I'd help by kicking off with my Pester in Action talk. So I guess a little bit about me. I'm Kevin Marquette. I'm a principal DevOps engineer at Loan Depot. I've been a Microsoft MVP. This is my first year at that. And I've done quite a bit of work for the PowerShell community in general. So I'm currently running the Southern California PowerShell user group. Yeah, feel free to, ping me if you have questions. I hang out on the PowerShell Reddit sub quite often, and I really enjoy that community. So if you've got some simple questions, there's lots of great people there that can probably help you work through them. All right, so Pester in action. So Pester is actually one of my favorite modules, and it's what it really is a unit testing framework. So the idea is you have something you need tested, and Pester's goal is to make that easier for us to do. So I'm going to jump over into VS Code here. And I think my demo space looks good. All right. So Pester itself, I think, has some pretty good introductory documentation. So if you go to their GitHub page on their wiki, I think there's some good explanation on a lot of things that I'm going to cover. So if I gloss over something too fast, just know that the wiki on Pester is actually a really good resource. So, all right. So what I'm looking at in front of me is a very minimal Pester syntax of how you basically write a test and grab some values. And what Pester offers us is a clean way to describe our tests that are hopefully easier to organize and read. And it kind of builds a framework around ways to report on and look at and process those results. So as I look at this example in front of me, it's implemented as its own DSL, domain-specific language. And hold on one second here. I gotta check on something really quick. All right, hopefully you guys are with me. Sorry about the interruption. I'm presenting from the office, and it is easy for them to see me and not realize I'm in the middle of something. So, okay, so I'm looking at is this DSL that is a way to describe what we're about to test. I'm using some simple language here. So this is a generic test, and I have an actual value that I want to validate. And in this case, I want to say it has the value, actual value. And the way we actually test it is we take this value and we pipe it to the should command that has its own syntax of saying should be actual value. So when I run this here, we'll see it execute down below. And I get this green text here. Let me kind of test my zoom in feature here. Awesome. The describe block will kind of give me the description. In this case, I said generic test. And then each it statement will have its own pass or fail saying, hey, it actually has this value. And then we kind of see how long each test ran. So working with that, there's lots of should examples that we can go through. So let me pop those open. And here's like several examples of of working with the should operator. And the first one that we were looking at before is should be, like this value should be an actual value, or this actual value should not be something else. You know, so many times it's not only valuable to test what something is, it's also valuable to test, you know, what it's not. So many times it's easy to test the happy path for things. And it's important to look for your edge cases and like some negative test conditions as well. So continuing down this path, and so I'm beginning with like the structure of the language. And as I run through some examples, this will help you be familiar with some of these pieces as we get into some more complex scenarios. So then the should be exactly is when you have an exact string. So when case matters, you can use the exactly match. There are tests for paths. So in this case, we're checking, you know, should the Windows folder, does this path exist? I mean, he's just like the test path, but it falls in the structure of describing things that you want to test and validate. Another common scenario is contents of files. So here's one where I'm putting some dummy values into a file, and then I'm coming back and testing that they have the patterns I'm looking for. And it actually does a match on regex. So you have something more complicated and you're comfortable with regex, you can use it in line here to account for this. I'll come back and explain this test drive in a moment, so don't mind that for now. Should contain exactly, and that's when you're looking for an exact match that is the exactly's are nice when you have a pattern that might be have valid like regex characters, but you don't actually want to test for the regex patterns. Quite often I see that. Quite often I see that with like IP addresses. You know, like that dot, that period. You know, quite often you'll use it in an IP address match, but it's really a wildcard match, and you can get some confusing results sometimes when you think you've got a plain string and the system thinks it's regex. And if you truly want to do a regex on normal value, we have the should match as an option. So should match is regex validation in this case. And then just look at the file, I got a should match exactly to say I want this pattern to be found, but it should be exactly this. And it'll fail when the case doesn't match. When you get to dealing with exceptions and error handling in your code, you can test that something should actually throw an error. So here's a scenario where I'm saying this line of code should throw some type of exception. And in this case, it's going to throw it because foo isn't actually a function on my system. So there's no way this is even valid PowerShell. So when it goes to execute this, I'm going to get an exception. And this test will catch that, hey, I expected to do something ugly, and I did. You can also test the negative of that, where you run some code to test that it should not throw. But when you're dealing with pester tests, the expectation is that nothing should throw an exception unless you're actually testing for it. So the proper way to handle this is to actually just set your values and move on, or run your scripts and commands, instead of wrapping something in a should not throw condition. I think there might have been like some early guides, like if you saw some earlier tests that people wrote with Pester, I think that was more common to do that. Yes, the recommendation now is like just write your code. If it fails, let that be a failure test there'll just be a failure condition for the test. And then if you need to throw a specific message, like you can actually check for the message that is being thrown. That way, if you're testing one thing and you get a different exception than what you expect, there's one way to account for it. And you can also like test on exception types, and there's more features there. Probably the most common one I use all the time is something should either be null or empty, or not be, or should not be null or empty. And so many times I will run a command, get a result, and I'll basically say, hey, this value should not be empty, or this value should be empty, before I go on to do more complex tests. And then some more general options is just the should be true, should be false, make sure there's a count, a certain number of things, or the value is less than or greater than something, or even the type of something should match. And these operators, if I do for should, I think we should get some autocomplete to scroll through and see all the possible options. So there's quite a bit of things that you can check for. And so feel free to experiment and reference the documentation. And I suppose I should take a moment to point out that the code that I'm looking at here today, I keep it on my GitHub page. So just to bounce back full circle here, repositories, Pester in action. So if you want to download these examples and follow along or work through them later, the Pester in action repo on GitHub is where I keep all these files. And what I like about putting my content on GitHub is that I can clone or download it. So if you want a zip file of all this stuff, you can just go download and you have your own copy of all these scripts. Excellent. So let's bounce back into
Kevin, I'll go ahead and post that
example.
In the chat.
And then the way you generally run Pester tests is using the command invoke Pester. You can optionally provide a file to execute. And if you don't, it will find all of the tests inside any folders in any subdirectories. So let's run this guy to see a full report. And kind of see this at a higher level. All right, so back to the output here. So not only am I seeing one line per test for each of those examples that we just looked at, I also get the results at the end that tell me, how many of these passed and failed for that example. And so something failed, this would be in red, and we have, skipped or pending. So it's a good way to execute some tests, get some clean output and results back, telling you that what your final results are. So that's one of the values of Pester itself, is that you don't have to write the reporting, the output, and error handling when something goes wrong. You can just do your tests and let Pester do what it does best. And I guess I should probably show you what a failure looks like real quick, because I don't think I actually have that example. So let me look at a failure. So I'm going to take this first one, and I'm going to I'm going to call this like something else. So here I actually have an invalid test, and this guy is going to fail when I run him. Oh, I actually have to run him though. And when he actually fails here, we get the messaging that my test says it has the value, actual value. That's what my description was. Then Pester says, you know what? I expected these strings to be the same, but they were different. The length is different, and it tells you where it sees the difference between these two values, and you see them side by side. So if you're writing your own scripts to test either your code or anything else, you'd have generally have to account for those things. And this is like one of those first places where Pester starts adding a lot of value in, and just write your tests as simple as you can and let it take care of the reporting and the validation and the feedback to everybody that's using it. All right. So show examples, we just looked at those. So other features of Pester. Crack this one open. Oh, we're jumping. All right, scroll back to the top here. Okay, so back to basic test with context. So sometimes you find that the two levels of describe and its statements isn't enough organization. And we kind of have like a third bucket we can use. We can actually give something a context. So it can be testing something very generically and say, in this context, it's when, you know, I have a server available and you run a bunch of tests. And you have a second context that says the server is not available and have a different set of tests. It's just kind of a way to like group and collect them together. And when this runs, you know, we see the describe block, then the context is indented, and then each test and every many tests you have are stepped in from that. Okay, so another good feature is the because flag on the should statement. And this will give you better failure messages when there's an error. So in this case, when I run this, everything is fine because there's nothing wrong. But if I have something wrong in here, I run it. Not only am I going to get the default messaging, but I'm going to get my custom messaging so that I'm kind of like giving instructions back to myself as to why I expected this test to succeed or fail. And this can be really valuable when you have, since on here we see visually the line of the failure, like this is the line that actually failed. You might have a test that kind of calls the same line multiple times at different stages of the test. And this because statement gives you a way to make it a little bit more unique and differentiated. And like, here's a scenario where I've got some random failure that when I run this will basically either intermittently pass or fail. And if I didn't have my because statement, I wouldn't know which one was actually passing. You know, like here I'm saying I expected 0 because it's the main test case, which is actually this one here. So in this case, the first one passed because the random value just happened to be 0. And the second one, I got a 1, so it failed. And it can be very much easier to see that with this because statement, which line actually failed. And quite often, I actually have an example here of me using some real code. So as I go through this, I littered in the demo today some real life examples from my projects. These are not shared on the repository in most cases, but I wanted to kind of have some real world scenarios so that you could see what it looks like. And so here's one where I have a test that's selecting some unique objects on a property. And when pieces of the test are out of context, it's hard to really know what I'm trying to test here. So here I'm testing that it should contain, you know, these should be left in the list. And then the next one is the order. And it's much easier for me to understand what's going on here. Like, why should it be this? Because I gave myself a message that will give me value when the error fails. So yeah, so when in doubt, or when it gets when it's not clear with just the test on its own, is a good idea to use the because, so we get like good visibility on those things. Now, I glossed over our test drive before, and I'm going to loop back to that now. So an important thing about when you're writing tests and validation, like having stuff being very consistent and your environment set up to be clean is really helpful. So one thing Pester does is when your test starts, it creates a special drive, actually called the test drive, that you can create files and manipulate stuff on that drive. And when your tests are over, it gets cleaned up. And that really means is you have a clean workspace every time the test runs. That in this case, I'm doing set content on this file. And you might have the case where if I'm just doing on the C drive, the first time you run the test, it'll pass because the file doesn't exist. But the second time through, it might fail because you didn't get cleaned up from the previous test, so the file already exists. So having that known clean state is where this test drive comes in really handy when doing file-based tests and validation. Let's see, I've got an example here where I'm doing some fancy stuff with Git, I believe. I'll close this panel here. And this is kind of a case where I have an internal command that it invokes Git commands. And I basically create a repository on the temp drive so I can run some executions against it, because it's, when you create a Git repo, it drops in a .git folder and does some stuff. And then when I'm all said and done, or when I run it the next time, we'll have a new location, a new folder in this test drive that I can work with. The secret behind that test drive is it's actually just using a folder inside your environment temp. So the reality is that it's grabbing a unique folder location inside your, what is it, like env temp folder. And actually, I actually did something kind of like this, new GUID. It actually creates and makes sure the folder is there and assigns that and maps that test drive to it. So it's getting clever, but it's basically doing work that you don't have to do. And so when I run this, we should see him execute cleanly. The test drive contains the value. And if I run this again, it'll succeed because it's still creating the file for the first time. Before each. So like I mentioned that it's important to have a consistent known state for your tests. So the before each allows you to run a command or a statement before each one of these if statements. So instead of having this code repeated in multiple locations, I can back up and just place it once in this before each, and I will know that I will cleanly get a file with this content at the beginning. Because in a way, here's a spot where my test is changing and manipulating the content, and I need it to not impact the one down below. And that's the exact beautiful thing that the before each does for us here. So before each change in value contains value. And then on that note, there's actually quite a few statements you can work with. There's the before all, which it will run once for every test that you have. There's a before each that I just mentioned. And then we got the inverse, after each and after all, that runs at the end to do cleanup. So if you have some things that need, so I've talked about the file system, like the temp drive, kind of gets cleaned up on its own. But if you're doing something that's a little bit more impactful, like, I don't know, like changing registry keys or, I don't know, updating database tables, you might have a case where you set a state, where you grab the state on the before all and you set it back to what it was in the after all. And so I'm going to run this block here since I have all these write hosts, so we can actually see the order of execution on this stuff. And notice that my first one is going to fail, this first it statement, and we'll see the second one should still run. So when we run all of these, our first describe, we do the before all, before each, the first it, then the after each cleans up. So we're still doing the after statements, even though we got a failure, and it gets reported back to us. Then it moves on to the next one. Before each, second it, after each, and then we get the values back. And when it's all done, we get the after all statement. So you have those hooks to have stuff happen kind of where you need it. And then I think one of my best examples is probably this internal function here that I have. I call it protect clipboard. And what this function does is it grabs whatever's on my clipboard and will encrypt it for me. Because quite often now I'm moving values back and forth, and sometimes I have something that I want to be encrypted before I paste it somewhere else. And this does all the hard logic figuring out how to encrypt it. But for testing it, by before all, I'm capturing the state. So I figure out what's in the clipboard and I save it so that later, if I jump down to it, after all, I put it back. Because the clipboard is something that if I mess with it, I'm going to create a poor user experience for myself. Because I might have something on the clipboard that I want to keep, and I don't want my tests that when I run them to wipe it out and or put bad values in there that I think are still valid when I go to use them later, especially when they're encrypted and I have no idea what they actually are. And then the second thing I'm doing internally here is I've got some standard values that I set the clipboard to before each test that runs below. And if I look at this, I have 2 tests that run where I protect the clipboard here, and my value should come out encrypted. And I do something again that protects it, that actually replaces it in place. You know, implementation details, but the point is I have tests that run are manipulating the states, and I don't want it to impact me after the test is finished. And even if they fail, I know my after all is going to put stuff back the way it belongs. So then another kind of cool feature is test cases. So often you'll find yourself having a test that you want to run multiple times and just change some of the parameters to it. So here's something where I'm testing to make sure that these aliases with these commands exist on this system. So there's 2 ways to approach this. The first one is to do it, I suppose, the hard way, where since Pester is just PowerShell commands, right? This is a command, this is a string, this is a script block. It's perfectly valid to run other PowerShell, such as a for each, around your it statements. I think with some changes coming with PowerShell or Pester 5, I'm starting to recommend against this anyways. It's a hack that I used to do quite often, but there's some optimizations where these external loops might make things a little bit more complicated or run slower. Potentially. But anyway, but the point is, for each loop, I run the statement and it's doing the test to validate that from my node in the test cases, that the alias and the command match.
Kevin, can
yes.
you hear me?
Yep.
So what version of Pester are you using here, just out of curiosity?
Ooh, so I'm using the officially released. Let me see which one I am on. Get module Pester available. I've got like 4.7.3. And I only mentioned 5 because I see a lot of work happening on Pester 5. It's still in like an alpha state. So I don't know when they'll actually announce and actually have a release for it. I think they'll be cautious because there's quite a bit of rewrites. I think their tests are all passing. And I'm actually pretty hopeful for most of the changes and features coming in it, because in a way, they're not changing much, but I believe they're making it more extendable for future growth later on. And there's one implementation nuance where running scripts outside of it might get executed twice in certain scenarios when you wouldn't have expected them to. Like I said, there's a lot of nuances there, but my advice now is try not to do custom looping outside of the it statements. Thankfully, for test cases in this exact scenario, there's built-in support for having a single test and passing it a collection of hash tables that are the test cases that you want tested for each item in that list. The syntax here is that it will map. Let me go pull my object up again so we see it kind of close here. That the test cases, in this case, are an array of hash tables. And this is actually kind of important to remember, is that these are hash tables in here, not like objects or strings or just a collection. It's actually an array of hash tables. And then when you get down to the actual implementation here, they're basically mapping these keys in the hash table to these parameters on this script. So I'm basically mapping alias to get alias and the command to command. And then the other feature is this special syntax in this string that Pester will inject the alias and command into these two spots. So let me go and run this. So I'll load my test cases. And then I'm going to run my actual test this time. And we're going to see one of these fail because I don't have an alias on this system. But we can see how it walked over and injected in, the alias and the command from the hash table. And then I actually get an error from my get alias that, hey, I can't find a matching alias because it doesn't exist. And then my actual statement here is telling me that I expected get WMI object as a result, but got null, which basically means, hey, I want to get an object, and my definition was nothing when it should have been something. Because the real alias here is like GWMI, right? It's like get WMI instead of just WMI, and that's why that one failed. But so you can see how it repeated this 4 times for the 4 items. I pull up a test case here. Let me look at this one. All right, so here is a test or a function of mine that tests endpoints. Like I give it some parameters and it walks the various options and gives me results back. So my test cases in this case, I have a matrix of source modes and target modes and environments that I'm testing. So I actually have one of these for each test I want ran. And then the end result, my it statement, it scrolls off the screen a bit, but I'm saying like the source mode, the target mode from the hash table should not throw. And my parameters get mapped based off of this test case right here that I just passed in. And the command gets executed once for every one of those. A small nuance here is these brackets aren't actually part of the Pester syntax. It's just a personal preference of mine. I like knowing when I'm injecting values into a string, what the edges of those are. So I could have done pipes or anything, but I kind of like doing brackets to denote me as a PowerShell dev. I'm placing a value in there. So when it's null, like I see the braces closed. If it's just white space, I see them white apart. Or more importantly, if my value has white space, I'll actually see that on my delimiter here. I just didn't want to get confused between the dual syntax here because this is the value that's injected, and this is just syntactic sugar that I like to toss onto things. So I can save that. And I might have another example on this one. Let me take a peek at them. Like here's one where I'm validating that I can identify. I've got some logic here that's taking raw data and basically guessing or predicting the data type. So I have test cases here where I'm giving it different types of strings and values, and I'm expecting it to correctly pull out what I think it should be. So this one here should find the GUID in this list to say it found the GUID type, email address, URIs. Actually, this one here is actually a failure condition, I think. I might have one up above that's the actual, yeah, this is my validation. So if it has these values, no more failure cases. I know I've got some valid values in here someplace. Read my statements. Correctly test valid arrays of values. Okay, so here's my valid cases. So it matches an array of GUIDs. This one here's an array of email addresses. So you can see how I have multiple things I want tested, different permutations. My logic internally, I'm just doing one thing very simply, and I get really great test coverage on that. So this is a file that's doing not only the valid cases, but this is actually invalid tests. So when it's not a GUID, these things should all of these should fail. Whew. And my screen has just got really glitchy all of a sudden. I don't know if you guys are seeing that. Is just VS Code? So I'm going to launch that again. That was I've seen all kinds of distortion artifacts there. Never seen that before.
Yeah,
So
it's showing up on the YouTube.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm back to normal now. So when it catches up, I think we'll be good. All right. So invalid and valid test cases. Let's see. Another pair of features here is in module scope, right? If you're testing modules and validating them, sometimes you'll have either commands or values that exist inside the module only that you want to like investigate or test. So the in-module scope feature allows you to say, inside this module Pester, run this test. And this one I'm looking at in front of me is I've looked under the covers with Pester, and I know they've got this variable called save commands that they use. So if I just check this value right now, like it's null for me outside of the module. But if I run this test from inside the module scope, I actually find that this value is not null or empty. Yeah, so if I do this here, I should get the, actually, I think I need to do just the scribe. Let me just run this as the scribe. And he's going to fail, but if I actually do him in module scope, he succeeds. So that can be really powerful sometimes. And I say in module scope, but if you have stuff that is script scoped inside your module, that stays within your module, and then classes are the other example. That's probably what I have right here. So I crack this module or test open. I have to go, so classes are really ugly in PowerShell, and exposing them externally is kind of annoying. So generally when I have to test classes from a module that uses them, I do it in the scope of that module. Because here is a custom class that just does not exist outside that module and just hard to work with. So I think if I just run this guy here directly, I'll probably get an error, I hope, that says, you know, hey, I can't find this type. I have no idea what it is, how to work with it. But me as a dev, I still want to test it. So that's where the in-module scope gives me access to run tests against it. And here's just a case where I create one instance of it. And then I have just multiple tests that are doing stuff on it just to verify it's performing properly. And then the next kind of advanced feature is the ability to mock commands. Now, this opens up some advanced testing scenarios where you have data that you're calling a function or a command that's pulling information from an external resource that either may or may not be available, or the data might be constantly changing. So here's a case where I know this is a super simple example, but I'm basically wanting to call this function and get the same results every time I call it. And the get date by definition gets the current date, so I can never compare against it. And you might have some other tests that say, hey, what happens if, you know, if you need tests to say, okay, on midnight or on, you know, New Year's Eve 2000, you know, are we gonna have like, or 1999, are we gonna have a rollover issue? You can have tests that run on the edges of important dates, or other scenarios where you want solid, consistent data to come back the same way every time. And there's also the ability to assert that the mock was called. And by mocking, it's like faking it out, right? I'm creating a fake function that stands in place of the get date. And if I want to make sure it gets called a certain amount of times, I can validate against that as well. And I like to so the get date's not it's a good example and show you data that should be not changing for your tests. But the examples are probably more where, actually, you know, I got one here below. Let me just hop into my mock example, and it might make more sense here. So here's a function of mine. I call it start dev task, that for me goes out and creates a ticket in Jira, and it creates a local branch in my Git source control that matches the ticket number, right? So I basically run this command to very easily create my tickets and my branches so they match, and just starts off my workflow. Now, I want to test start dev task, but I don't really need to or care to validate, you know, does get info or does get credential actually give me a credential? Like, I can trust that PowerShell get credential works correctly. So for my needs, I just need it to give me something that I can do my validation against. And same for these other features, like getting a Jira session or invoking LD Git. Like, this guy definitely uses Jira and uses Git, but my test isn't about testing that Jira and Git work. It's about testing how my code responds to the values returned from those dependencies. So here's a case where I literally returned the minimum data needed, because sometimes I say, you know, get a session, and if I have an object true or false, or if it's empty or not, null or not, my logic continues inside the function. So this is the way I'm abstracting out stuff that I don't care to test, so I can really focus on the stuff that I do want to test. Because the reality is, I won't always have a Jira server everywhere I go. And maybe I only have access to Git. Like in my scenario, I think I'm even doing like a fetch branch off of the most current master. And I might have some scenarios where I don't have Git or Jira available, and I can just fake the interaction with them. And so here, these mocks are global for the describe block. But if I need a mock for a very specific scenario, I can overwrite it again. Or I can, because I'm not overwriting it here. Is that a valid statement? It is. If I had this defined outside, he'd overwrite it. But I think I wanted this guy mocked just for this test. But if I step down here, in this context, like I said, that keyword lets you organize in subgroup tests. I can override a mock. So like I can override a mock that might be defined above. So I'm not actually doing that scenario. Like here, I'm just doing two tests where I just get Jira issue and return nothing. So what happens when I get no issues from Jira? And then here's an example where my get Jira issue command, I need to return something because I might actually need an object with all these properties. This is kind of a complex object, so it looks kind of ugly now. But because I'm faking this out, I got all access to all the features that I would need when I come down here saying start dev task off this key. So, oh, and then one other tip, I guess, that if you're having issue with your mock commands, and I haven't always found the correlation behind this, but sometimes I've had some mocks that just would not work no matter what I tried, where it felt like I declare the mock and I expected it to be either executed a certain amount of times or it would return certain data that wasn't returning, like it just effectively was just non-existent. And I have found that if I do in module scope for my module and do all my mocks inside that module, there's no external factors on the system that get in my way. And my mocks have gotten significantly more reliable once I started doing that. So me, as a best practice or a pattern that I do is every time I'm going to mock something, I toss everything inside an in-module scope. And it's worked out great for my stuff to be a lot more solid and more consistent. And all right, so I'm gonna hop out and take a peek at chat real quick to see if we have questions. I know I kind of covered a lot here. So do I need to like clarify anything, or are we kind of good to keep on moving with this? Excellent. So yeah, I'll probably hop back out and chat occasionally just to make sure that just kind of get that pulse of where we're at with things from time to time here. Okay, so back out to my demo. We're at 522. Excellent. Okay, so I've got an example here that I'm gonna run through at least part of it, where I take a simple script and start wrapping tests around it, and kind of show you kind of how the mindset shifts as you go from scripts to more towards functions. So here's a small piece of code that creates a desktop shortcut. Right? He's pretty simple. Yeah, it's not. I just did a quick search and I pulled this off the Admin Arsenal blog, and he's basically, I set two variables, and I create a WScript shell object, com object, and I call the function create shortcut on this object here that gives me a shortcut object back that I assign the target path to match my target file, and then I save it. So this is a simple script, and let me check my desktop real quick. And I don't think I have that file on here. It doesn't look like I do. So if we run this, and I go check my desktop, oh, there's that notepad link that it just created. So now it's easy for me to check and test that the script does what it says it does. It's so hard coded to a very specific need, right? So let me just go and delete this guy right now and take a peek at the tests that I had for it. So one common pattern that you do with your Pester tests is name them with tests.ps1. And I believe, and I think this needs to be a capital T for tests, so that just capitalize the T when you're doing the tests. And Pester will recognize that as a test file and can execute it when you're just doing an invoke Pester on its own. So simple enough. The test for this, since the command is so simple, is I run the script, and forgive this dance up here. I'm doing some loading here to dynamically grab the name of the file instead of hard coding the script I want to load. So back to these patterns, quite often I'll have for scripts, I'll often have my tests right next to them. And since they're named the same, I can use some copy paste shortcuts here to get a path to it that I can use in other scripts. So that's why this guy's a little bit uglier than you'd think, because I'm trying to be clever and loading him dynamically. But in this case, I am running the script and I'm checking the path that exists. Like this is basically what I did by hand a second ago. And so when I run this time, okay, create shortcut on the desktop. Now, if I run this a second time, does it fail or pass? It fails. I guess it works around that. But as you start getting, they start going to like more advanced scripts, and you start like parameterizing them. Like here's the same code I had before, but this time I'm adding two parameters, right? I'm saying, give me a source and a destination, and then I'll create the script. And then here's a case where I'm doing a little validation to make sure the source exists. This internal logic here is pretty much identical, except for I'm pulling those parameters in. And now that we're doing parameterized, we can actually start doing permutations and test we get more value out of these tests, I feel. So, all right, same scaffolding at the beginning, so I skip over it. It creates a shortcut. And I'm using the test drive this time. So I'm saying the test drive text and link should not exist. I'm going to create a test file. I'm going to execute my incoming script with this source and this destination to get this file. And this is the first time I've seen the $test drive variable. He is actually a variable that points to wherever this location is. And while I try to use test drive wherever I can, you will find, like when you're interacting with .NET objects that take a path that don't understand the PowerShell drive, that it will just throw errors. So the Pester team were friendly or nice enough to give us a variable that will always match the test drive, except this one here is the actual full path to the test drive. C:user profile temp GUID and the test drive, because it's always a local location. So we make sure it doesn't exist. We execute this with a destination, and our output file should exist. So when we run this one, hey, we still create the shortcut. And all right, so then we keep going, right? We get more complex. And I think as this guy grows up, we're going to start adding more like validation to it. I've got my help base now. I'm doing real parameters, getting really clever with this thing. Like as he grows in complexity, or I take source value from pipeline, destination from pipeline as well, and then, or I can give the file a specific name, and then internally, I've got my process block that's doing the looping over everything. So as I'm creating my code a little bit more complex, it's important that I start testing for these different paths. So when I see my code branch like this, where I have an if statement based off of a value, these are ideal things to write to have two different tests that test both of these scenarios, right? I need one test that does it with a name, and I need a second test that doesn't have a name, because otherwise your code gets skipped and you get better coverage. So when you're trying to think about writing tests, scan through it real quick and see where you're branching different directions, right? Because this guy's variable, or this variable is important to the flow. You should have a test for him if he exists or not. And I'm hoping I did that in here. So basic features, I create a bunch of files to play with. And then here's the case where it creates a shortcut. And here's the place where I got the name. It creates a named shortcut. So here I just know automatically that both those paths are tested. Because it would be such a shame if you're accidentally in here, and you accidentally like add a key, like when the stuff gets long past the end, and you accidentally add something in here that you didn't intend, and you're only testing the one thing, you just got a bug waiting to happen. So test coverage, it really helps. And then I've got the same pattern here for the get shortcut. I'm actually going to skim past. Actually, no, I actually want to take a peek at this.
Kevin, just to interrupt there for a second.
Yeah.
I put a message out to everybody, since I know that you kind of have a hard stop at about 8:30 Central, 6:30 your time. So I just wanted to let everybody know if you guys have questions, go ahead and ask in the chat, and we can kind of stop around 8:15, 8:20, and Kevin can answer questions. So
okay. I think I might have a little bit of flexibility on that. I'll be definitely watching my time once we cross that 8:30 point. So, but yeah, thanks for giving the heads up. All right, so that's like testing it. So I'm going to show one of my modules. So PSGraph is a module that I that I manage, and it's out on GitHub. And talking about like structuring and where I put my tests, it's like when I look at on the left here is all the files for my project for this module, and most of the PowerShell for it sits in these public-private folders for the module. And this is just a common pattern that you will see a lot of module authors have, is that they'll put like, one test per function or one file per function in their module. And I kind of mimic that in my tests, where I have a test for every function that I have listed out separately. So when I'm testing my my edge tests here, this is all about testing my edge. So I'm doing stuff that should not throw, which actually I can clean that up. Like I mentioned before, that I don't need to be doing that anymore. That's a pattern I use quite a bit. I got like simple edges with attributes, and I try to find all the different permutations of the way this command can be used so that when I make changes to it, I catch all those. So just this one command, I've got, 100 lines of tests so that when I change something, and it kind of repeats that way, like for everything I have, I've got fairly good coverage of the various different ways that I call these commands and objects. And so my pattern is I have a test folder and the file matches the name. And that allows me to do one thing that's kind of clever in that I actually have a module scoped test. So every time I do it, whenever I check in my code and make changes to my module, I have a requirement that all my tests have to pass. Right. So if you get doing like build release pipelines or automation type stuff, that every time I make a change, I want my tests to tell me if I screwed something up versus me have to manually poke around and look at these things. So I have a few kind of fancy tests out here. That the first big one, I guess, is that all my commands pass the script analyzer rules. If you're not using script analyzer, I highly recommend it because it'll just point out best practices in your existing code that you might not even realize were there. And so I got some fancy logic here that walks every file and runs some tests on it. And then a second trick I do for myself to keep myself honest is I say every public command has a test. So I'm literally getting all the commands from my module, and then I walk this folder. I walk this folder to test to make sure there's a test in there. So what it means is when I add one new function piece of code, my first requirement is I have to add a test for it. And that helps me keep good test coverage and as if you're on like a team where lots of people working together or doing stuff in open source, making sure that these tests are like self-reinforcing has a ton of value and get a lot of return on them. I think I wanted to show something specific though out of that module. Oh yeah, then I have a specific task that actually runs my tests. So if I pop this open. So like I said, you can at any time, go to a module, cd workspace, cd ps graph, invoke Pester. I'm trying to think of anything that will break without a variable, but we'll see. I'll just kick this guy off. So here as this is running, we're actually seeing, here's the script analyzer rules running. Let's run through and just doing a thorough validation of my entire module. I'm going to bail on it here so I don't have to wait for the whole thing to run. But there's several parameters, invoke, Pester, such as doing like tags, or I might label some stuff as build type tests. In fact, if I hop in here, I don't have any labels in these guys. Some of my projects I use labels, and you can take a describe and say, I need to give this guy a special label, call it a tag. It only happens at build time. And then when I come back over to Pester, I can say invoke Pester tag build, and it'll go through and only run. Actually, take that back. Okay, so I did forget one gotcha there. If you do use tags, you actually have to tag everything. So one nuance, I don't know if I like it or not, but if you don't have a tag on something and you run the invoke pester, it will run it every time regardless. So I tend to have stuff either tagged as build tags to do a build time, or I use a different one called integration, but these are whatever words I want, or like local only, but I can run on my local box to do some validation versus other locations. But I'm getting off a tangent there. What I wanted to show you though was the command I actually run in my tests. Right, I think there's, pop this guy back up again. So I use splatting quite a bit. If you're not familiar with it, this is just a hash table, key value pairs, that I will splat to the command later. It'll actually map each of these values to a parameter in this function. So here's the parameters that I do. I add an output file in an output format. And this is because it basically kicks out the results to a file that I can report on and use in statistics later on. Part of this continuous integration, continuous delivery, a lot of those frameworks like TFS or Jenkins will have support for posting test results. And by adding these two lines, I'm basically spitting out an NUnit XML style file that I can consume later. The pass-through option gives me a rich PowerShell object back that I can look at later. And I'll show you what I do with it here in a moment. My path is always the tests folder. I exclude any test anywhere else. And I also say show the fails and summary, which basically means most of that green text that we had here, I won't output every little item. And I kind of do that for performance. Like locally, I'll run this to see everything, but I find that there's just a very small overhead, just a few milliseconds here and there, that if I suppress the output, my builds run faster. And then tag build. So I'm definitely catching stuff with the build tag, even though this project isn't properly tagged for it. There are also code coverage reporting features in Pester. I'm not going to dive into it here, but using the code coverage where you give it the file you're testing and the output file to get the results, can tell you if you've gotten like 5% or 20% coverage. Like you really want your test to cover as much of your code as possible. And the test coverage will show you places where you might have gaps. You didn't realize it. But I'm kind of like wrapping around it here. I know it's probably a little complicated, a little complex, but since I've written this once, I can reuse this in all my projects. I benefit from the script. All right, so then I run my tests, get the results.
Kevin, we got an interesting question that you actually might have a good take on. If you want to pull up the comments section, you might just read it out loud and check it out.
Okay, so is well suited for test with complex suite of tests. Or okay, do I think Pester is good in the DevOps space for test-driven development with complex suite of tests, or more limited for practical tests, or both? Pester is amazingly flexible. You can use it for a ton of stuff. I do find, when I'm doing test-driven development, I actually do use it quite a bit for that. I do find some rough edges when the sheer number of tests get really high. And I'm kind of hoping their PowerShell 5 work will help with that. And what I mean by that, by high number of tests, and I'm going to jump way ahead just because it's on context here, is that I ran I'm gonna touch base on infrastructure validation here. Or maybe this is the segue to it. But I run validation not only on my code for unit tests and integration tests, I also use it for infrastructure validation. So where I test the stuff I configure in my environment. And here's a case where I run 68,000 tests against all of my environments and all of my endpoints and all of my load balancer configurations. I mean, he ran a while, like an hour, 50, almost 2 hours. That's no joke. But 68,000 tests. And I think this one was, in this case, was probably more limited on the REST endpoints that I was hitting for that specific module. But over that kind of gives you a glimpse that it's very flexible and powerful and can be applied in many different situations. Let's see. There was one more test I skipped over on my module that I find has a lot of value. Is that I did the script analyzer and I did the functions, but I also am a strong proponent that you should have help for your public modules. So I actually have a test that will walk all my functions and make sure they have at least a description and an example. So when anybody adds code to any of my projects, I'm requiring them to give me an example. And I actually do a regex match here to make sure they have the command in the example that they're testing. Internally, I also have required descriptions for parameters. I kind of go back and forth on that one, but I was able to kind of use the Pester as a way to enforce and kind of promote that. I had looked at ways of potentially doing it for, I have another project where we have lots of JSON inside of it that if my JSON isn't valid, I kick it back. So I guess back to your original question, for test-driven development, I think that was probably one of the use cases it was intended for. But then we start talking about the complex suite of tests. I think the gotchas tend to be when you have to integrate with external stuff, right? Like I talked about mocking quite a bit, but some things are just more difficult to mock than others. Like I think invoke web request. I'm good at mocking errors and null values coming back, but he gets a little bit more ugly when I want a real structured, results object coming back from him. And I often cheat more than not on that. All right, let me hop here. So those are more about code coverage, code structure. I kind of covered that. I do have in this project, but I'm not going to run through it, but a demo where that I have tests that validate the structure and construction of a module, and that starting with the tests, I can do test-driven module building, where actually maybe I can do this here. So if I just do, let's run this chunk here as a preview, I guess. So maybe I can't run that. What am I missing here? Name, join path, module, child path name. So here's one where I actually have the test first to build FA. Maybe I don't have that guy working. Huh. Oh, maybe it's a good point. I'm skipping this, but I have a demo test here, this PSD1 in this Pester in Action project. That'd be worth taking a peek at if you're curious on that. Inside for module demo, that this test here, that if you drop this into a new folder and get him passing all of these tests, you have a valid working module. Like that was the point of this test here is I could drop him into something and he'd validate saying, hey, you know, is the PowerShell valid? It's doing the comment based help, but even early on, it's saying like, is there a manifest file? Does the module path match what is in there? So yeah, so it's test-driven module development. I'm gonna have to fix him though. And then this walks through the incremental steps of actually building a module via scripts. So then jumping into operational validation, right? So most of the features people tend to think about for testing your PowerShell code and your scripts and your modules. But like I said, infrastructure validation has its place too. I think, and for many people, this might be a good place to start where if you're having a challenge automating your new server setup and configuration, step back and automate the validation of it, right? Like, how do you know if everything is the way it's supposed to be? Maybe you just write tests to validate that. So let me take a peek at these guys. And like, here's one where this test is listing the required features. Like, hey, I know I have to have all these features added on these set of servers. And here I'm looping over them, which I know I mentioned not to kind of move away from that, but this is how I used to write all these. I'm looping over this says, hey, is this feature even installed or not? And then this is a really old one, like, hey, do I have the right version of .NET on this box? And do I have these specific hotfixes? Like, if it's important that you have to check something on a lot of boxes, and you haven't been able to get time to automate the deployment and configuration of those, take your checklists and make them tests. And you can get these reports at the end that show you, you know, how good and consistent your stuff is. I have some more in-depth one here for like SQL Server and Active Directory. Like, oh, that's not what I wanted. I thought I had one here for. No, that didn't work. Okay, so a little distracted here. So SQL configuration. Like, here's one that I actually used at a previous employer. In fact, I think Matt might recognize some of this. Where here I'm validating that, hey, these SQL servers, I've got because that was our standard, a D SQL data folder, an L for SQL logs. Is SQL even installed? Like, is it even on the box, right? And is it running? Does it have? I didn't implement the SA password stuff. Versions of SQL, and here I'm actually getting clever. I'm just invoking SQL, running a select statement, and making sure the results are what I want it to be. Like, sometimes these tests can actually be pretty simple. And then here's one checking for the host name, because when you clone SQL servers, sometimes host names don't get set. And other access and security, which most of these are really SQL statements that I'm validating results on. And so your checklist doesn't have to be just like, once I've configured this thing and handed off, is it in good shape? But you might have cases later where you're troubleshooting this box in the future, right? You know, in my case, I was handing it over to a dev that have some problems, and I look at it again, like, well, I've got this list of things that definitely should be this specific way. Let me run my tests, get them out of the way, and I know I don't have to worry about those things. I can focus in on the deeper troubleshooting. The second value in like your operational validation is, you know, maybe this could be something you're doing before you do maintenance on a box, right? I go to make some changes. I can run my validation to make sure it's good. You know, apply my Windows updates or whatever changes, and run my validation again to see that nothing broke. And where's a good? Okay, so I'm gonna jump into some more of my more current internal ones, where here is me grabbing just some internal data. Black magic, I got a computer name here to work with. And if I run my internal server health test on this box, hope this box still exists. Let's scroll down so I actually see some results fly by. F8. And as it runs through here, you know what? PS sessions work fine. My IP and DNS are good for what my database says. We've had a reboot in the last 45 days. My DSE is in a good state. It's fairly current. Has run, and DSE is currently running. And I've got at least 5% space on the C drive. Like that's a nice quick spot check on just some common problems that I've been having on these systems. And if I take a peek at those, I mean, those tests really aren't all that complicated in most of these cases. You know, I do some fancy stuff to get a PS session early on because I'm doing most of our PS sessions. But like, hey, resolve DNS name. Like, do these values match whether I want them to match? You know, IP addresses on, has an IP address bound on the server that matches our metadata. So I'm literally asking the system to tell me if the address it has matches what I think it should, and you know, reboot. So knowing my infrastructure is in a good state. Then as I dive into application health tests, let me just run this guy. He might run a little bit longer, and I might see some failures on this one. I kind of expect it. But I'm actually running my application health tests. So I got some base server stuff that don't tell me a whole lot, but my applications, for everything I deploy to a server, I at least have a minimal health check to tell me if it's running or not. So this being a dev environment, I expect some things to be down. So I look at it, you know, running test is fine. This app, you know, I was able to hit this site and it was good. I was able to hit this diagnostic site and it was good. So here's like all these sites that I'm hitting to test that these various features and pieces are up and going. When I get down to these failures, like it expected this to have passed, but it failed my customized application test. I recognize this one as something we've decommissioned. So we've actually getting rid of this guy, but I've not removed him from this server yet. So that's why he failed. Same with this one. And I got one down here that is brand new, a new application that we haven't actually deployed to that environment yet. So I got a little drift between what I'm testing versus what's actually there. But if I was going to work on this box, I mean, you can see how many applications I have running, right? And there's so much value in saying, before I even touch this box, tell me what's up or down. Let me go do my maintenance, my work, my whatever it is, patches, and run my test again. And if I have these same, 4 failures, I can have a lot of confidence that things are working right. You know what I mean? So that's one of the powers of operational validation testing is I know it's good before I touch it. I know it's good when I walk away from it. And these tests here, we actually, part of our patching process internally is we automate it so that we run these tests, we capture the delta, like what failed, what passed, then we perform the updates, we do the reboots. Actually, backing up, I take the server out of the load balancing, right? We take it offline, out of the cluster, run the tests, patch it, validate it, and make sure the same things that passed before still pass. And if they do, we put it back into the cluster and add it to the VIP, the load balancing, if needed. And we're able to orchestrate that around and have a lot of confidence in our patching because of this. Like, how often have you patched a system and not really sure if you would have broken it or not? Any of these others worth diving into here? I think. And this is and that's actually that screenshot I was going to bounce out to. Like, this is the entirety of all of our. I mean, the F5 is kind of a complicated object, and we test a lot of little properties. You know, because I have an app in 2 data centers. You know, I've got like every server. I got, if you know the F5's load balancing, there's like the LTM pools, the LTM pool members. There's the virtual server address, the certificates that go on them, the health checks themselves, and we actually check that our health checks are the health checks we want them to be, and then global traffic management, GTM pools. So there's a lot of pieces of that stack that if we misconfigure one of those pieces, it is so ugly to troubleshoot and track backwards, but we can hop into our tests and see things. And this guy here is, I know there's a lot of failures in this one, and it's because I was like, we were changing stuff, and I was actually watching them propagate our changes through the environment. So I had cases where I had the expectation of a value because we changed something and we hadn't applied it yet. So that's where I pulled this guy from. Ooh. So I think I covered a lot of ground pretty quick there. Is there anything that you guys want me to touch on a little bit more or loop back to? I've probably got a few minutes here. I can answer some questions. And I'll definitely appreciate any feedback too. Like, I'm considering in the future breaking this into 2 talks. One where I focus a little bit more on the beginning, getting started, and I take like this last half hour, this ending part, and maybe make him a second talk where I can go a little bit more in depth in the advanced stuff and the operational validation. So I'd be curious on your feedback on that, or if this stuff in an hour and a half is about the right amount to consume. So
I think, Kevin, I think the operational validation stuff and the environment validation, I think that's stuff that would be probably a good thing to have in a second a second presentation. If people are aware, June, what's her last name? Blender, I think it is.
yeah.
She works for Sapien, and she did a presentation on Pester a couple of years ago, and it was pretty good. And a lot of the same stuff is covered, especially the stuff at the beginning. But when you start getting into it, this can be kind of a kind of overwhelming topic for people that are not used to seeing this, especially once you start getting into like module validation and stuff like that. I mean, I'm used to seeing it because I kind of came up from that in my PowerShell infancy. I kind of saw that from the beginning, so it's not all that new to me. But for some people that aren't used to seeing it, it can kind of like be kind of a just like drinking from a fire hose.
No, absolutely. And I know this presentation itself has gotten big, and I know my style is kind of, all right, let's start really high to kind of like to pull you in a little bit, get you comfortable with it, and then I kind of run really deep, just to kind of like show the possibilities. Because I know sometimes like the advanced stuff that sometimes you almost can't truly process it until you're sitting down to do those things. And that's kind of why I've always tossed those on the roadmap, so you can see the path ahead. And when you get to those challenges, you at least kind of can know where to test on. And okay, so I see a question here about server configs versus DSC managing configurations. And so when do you decide like which ones for DSC and which ones are tested with Pester? So I use DSC quite heavily. So I kind of like, for actually configuring the system, I'll trust DSC to do its job. But I was in a previous environment where I'd mostly use DSC to do like the initial setup, and that we wouldn't do the enforcement. And I wanted more visibility on the results of what was passing and failing, because while DSC is good at configuring a server, at least on version 4.0, the reporting to see what wasn't working very well left much to be desired. I think there's some options now with like the Azure DSC that gives you better reporting if you're in compliance or not. But at that resource level, the way to really see the stuff is kind of challenging. And I think one use case would be how you need to consume the results. Like if you need to have something you give to somebody, like a nice clean report, I think Pester might be a good starting point for it. Or it just might be that you have an environment where DSC just doesn't work for you. Like if you can go DSC and it will configure and enforce stuff, I mean, that's awesome, right? But maybe Pester's better at like the state of things. Like well, example from applications, right? Like I want DSC to configure the pools and the sites, but DSC shouldn't actually care if the site itself is having internal code issues. If I'm getting like a 500 error from the application, there's nothing DSC can do to fix that. And so I don't want those tests causing my system configuration to fail because it might not be a system configuration issue. It could just be, bad code deployment or a dependency of that site that's down, or hell, even a patch. So in its way, like DSCs for the configuration, and then you can step in with Pester to fill in the gaps and the holes. Because DSC is about states, and sometimes your tests are more than just the state of something.
Kevin, there was another question from Erwin, and I understand it's pretty late for him. Thanks for joining, Erwin. I know you're in the Netherlands, so it's pretty. You're a trooper for hanging in there with us. So, it says anyone doing any OVF in Azure DevOps? I don't know what your environment's like these days, Kevin, but I mean, there may be some other folks on here that are doing that.
So
I know I'm not.
So OVF is actually referring, I think it refers specifically to the operational validation framework. And I do have some information on some related modules. Oh, why is that doing that? Sorry, I think I didn't feel like I had time to jump into it, but I do have at least a reference to, I thought I did in here, the operational validation framework. So I don't actively use this, and Dev Black Ops anyways, I got some links here on the framework itself, and the idea is about taking your operational validation tests, packaging them into a module, and if you can deploy them to your servers, and like say here's or off the gallery, like here I'm installing one off as the current user, you can call like invoke operational validation, and give it the module name, and it will run the tests out of that module. So if you're needing a way to like box up your tests and run them on a server, this is a framework and some commands that kind of put some structure around that. So indirectly, I don't know how it would necessarily tie to the Azure DevOps, because I've learned that actually means something specific as well, and that's the TFS interface, the build release pipelines aspects of Azure. And so I suppose the comment could be made that you could deploy something and then have one of your tasks be like PS remoting execution of tests on the target system if you wanted to have that test ran that way, and that'd be probably perfectly valid to do. Whenever we release software, like I'd point out all those Where'd they go? Anyways, all those application tests. Now, I've got this complicated setup where I have this central database of everything about everything we do, such as every website. I know its IP address, I know its health monitors. And by having the health monitors in this database, I can use that in my tests. So those tests we looked at earlier were data driven. Like I was querying a central system to know what to look at on that server. And that test, when we do a deployment, we hit deploy to the server, we actually run that same test every time we deploy it to let us know if it succeeded or failed. And that same test is also configured on our load balancers to determine if we need to pull a node in or out of the VIP. So, and that I know that central database concept is probably a whole nother talk on its own, like having a place to put your information that you can pull from it and do things with is just a different way of thinking. And I know I've gotten a lot of mileage out of it in my internal organization. But I do what I can to hold the bar kind of high, and tests is one way to kind of help elevate and hold yourself to a higher standard and those that you work with.
Kevin, this has been great. I don't know how much more time you have, but if anybody has any more questions, this would be the time to ask, because I think in just a little bit, Kevin's going to have to go. He's got some work that he's got to take care of this evening. So if there is anything else, please share it in the chat. I'm going to kind of go off topic for just a second here and make a special announcement for those that are still kind of watching, and we'll have this on the recording. But I wanted to make sure that everybody knows about this. Give me just a second here. I'm going to switch to my screen. Let's see. I want to present. All right. I hope everybody can see this. Our next talk is going to be by Adam Driscoll. We don't know exactly when yet, but we're hoping probably end of April. So if you're around for that, I don't know what the format's going to be, if it's going to be in person or remote again, or how it's going to work yet. But this is the person that we have queued up for our April talk. So I'd like to just make sure everybody knows that. And when more details are available, I might make another video and let everybody know. So just want to make you aware. I'll turn it back over to Kevin for the last little bit here.
No, awesome. He's done a lot of great work. So he'd be a great session to catch as well. I think I'd probably use a lot of his tools. But so how many viewers did we end up with tonight? So 16 now. I think I saw us up at least 23 at one point.
I think we had as many as 28 at one time, but
28?
I think
Okay.
it was I definitely saw 23, 24, 25 in there somewhere. So
I don't know what I got to on Twitch, but I had a few viewers over there as well. So
yeah.
Awesome. Well, with that, I appreciate everybody for joining us that's still with us. Like I said, I know I'm cramming a lot in here, and hopefully I kind of inspired you with what's possible, even if I didn't get into the nitty-gritty details of how to actually achieve it. And hopefully at the same time, you got enough footing that it's approachable to start with. And yeah, so I appreciate you guys joining us. And like I said, I'm sure I will join you guys again in the future sometime, because I've got a handful of topics that I could probably talk on. And I'd love to see the Austin group kind of gain some energy and keep rolling with it. So
thanks for your time, Kevin. We appreciate it.
Yep. Thank you. Have a good evening, guys.
All right. Bye.